I was trying to meet a need. I didn't feel good about myself. I didn't have a healthy self-esteem by any stretch, and I've described it as deep self-loathing on former shows, and that's as I still use that language because I think that describes it best.
When we give ourselves permission to be vulnerable and that we don't have it all figured out, it just opens up so many doors and breaks down so many walls and barriers.
I would say more and more we're leaning into authentic leadership, but truly there's so many leaders, fake it till you make it, that whole I've got it all together.
We do not have this all figured out. There are times when we are in very dark places still in our personal lives.
Absolutely.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Living Richly podcast. We're so glad to have you back this week, and we're excited to be tackling a really big subject, I think something that most people struggle with, and that's imposter syndrome. And today we want to talk about how to stop feeling like a fraud and unleash our confidence. So let's jump right in. Why don't we start with areas in your life where maybe imposter syndrome has shown up the most? And Kate, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. It shows up everywhere, but it does all the time.
It's not limited to one area.
No,
yeah.
And it shows up I think a lot of people, it shows up for them at work. For me, it showed up, if I drill into one that really I have the most emotional connect with, it's the mom role. So it's that feeling like I don't fit in with the other mom. So part of, I've talked openly on the show about my divorce, but part of that journey for me, 9 years ago was me feeling like I'm living my supposed life. I'm living the life I'm supposed to live on paper in suburbia, the kids, the house, the car, all of it, right? Living perfectly. I lost the baby. All that stuff for me was total imposter syndrome. It's like me trying to live up to something that I felt I was supposed to be.
Right.
And so I would do it really well all the time. And then once I divorced, I would slowly lean into my true authentic self and realize how much of that was imposter syndrome, to the point I used to pick my kids up from school and I text my girlfriend Penny and I'd be like, one of these moms is not like the other. All the time. Yeah. So for me, that's probably the place I felt it the most at my heart.
Yeah. I can relate to the divorced mom aspect of that. And in terms of feeling like I'm not good enough, I should be doing more. Am I doing enough? Almost showing up too much and not authentically as a way to overcompensate. And then, of course, the career piece that I've spoken to where I spent, almost 2 decades in the HR space and then moved into the coaching and the wellness space with no paper credentials, no, university degree and anything around that. And that was a big, and it still is to some extent, although I've worked a lot on it, but that would be a big one for me.
Very similar to that would have been, when I remember going to the very first networking event after you brought me on and I started working as a coach. And I remember, when you would ask me, hey, have you ever thought about coaching? I'd be like, what the hell do I know about business?
Right.
And, we had that whole conversation around, that experience. So now I'm showing up at a networking event with in my mind, everyone around the table is this business owner, and business owner was this magical kind of woo. Yeah. And I'm supposed to be a coach here, and I'm going to be talking to these people about how much I know business. And I remember feeling completely, probably the word small in that moment of just I don't want.
I was trying to meet a need. I didn't feel good about myself. I didn't have a healthy self-esteem by any stretch, and I've described it as deep self-loathing on former shows, and that's as I still use that language because I think that describes it best. When I was 23 back in the church world, feeling like if only people knew, the real me here. And then my transition to coaching, I felt the very same thing. Right. Again, this notion of if people only knew where I came from, that I don't even have a university degree, that the best that I have is a Bible college degree, and realize how much that impacted me. But I think where it showed up and has shown up for me the most is more on the personal side. always being in a leadership role, always being in a helping role of serving other people and trying to make things better for people. And yet on the inside, my life was a mess. And so feeling very much like a fraud, not a hypocrite, because I was honestly trying. I wasn't deliberately trying to be someone I wasn't. But there was a big disconnect between my public self, and my private self.
You remember when we first, early in those days, we would even avoid referencing that we worked at the church, right? We would use the language of, well, in my, I used to work in a nonprofit, right? And that's, and that's the language because we thought, I don't know if we've ever had a conversation around this, but we both used that language, because we thought it helps set things up in a different. Now I'm like so comfortable in saying,
Jesus, if Jay Shetty after 2 years can claim he lived life as a monk, I think we were pastors for like a really long time.
Yeah.
It was,
so fuck you, Jay Shetty.
I'm not sure. No, that was not the message we wanted. Sorry, Jay. He got carried away there. But, in preparation for the show, I know you and I, in our work, we work primarily with leaders and successful, high-achieving leaders, and I don't think one of them that I work with has not experienced this at some level, experience it regularly, the whole imposter feeling like a fraud. I don't deserve to be at the table. Like this kind of language internally, it affects, apparently the research shows over 70% of the population struggle with it at some level. And I wonder why you guys think that number is so high, especially when you think it's being experienced by folks who, by all appearances, external appearances, are successful and movers and shakers. So what do you think?
For me, I think part of it is that oftentimes people who are successful, while there's all kinds of elements that, the hard work, all of that stuff that happens, in many cases, you fall into success, right? The doors open the right way, the opportunities come. And again, I'm not diminishing that there's all the hard work and everything else that happens, but some part of success, you can have two people who work just as hard, two people who are just as intelligent, and sometimes the opportunity just happens. It's not, I'm hesitating to use luck, but the opportunities just show up. Suddenly they've got, holy shit, I'm here. And they don't feel like they've really done, boy, how did I get here? And if they only knew that I think that sometimes that's part of it for some people.
Yeah. I heard someone define luck as when preparation meets opportunity, right? Which I love, but I get your point. Sometimes we find ourselves in a place we hadn't imagined and we're like, how the hell did I get here?
Well, and all of a sudden you're there and you're like, how am I supposed to not show up like as the leader? So there's all this pressure to show up. And, it's, I would say more and more we're leaning into authentic leadership, but truly there's so many leaders, fake it till you make it, that whole, like, I've got it all together. I can't
Don't let them see you sweat.
I can't show vulnerability. If I show vulnerability, then that means I'm not a strong leader. Right. So I think that imposter syndrome comes from that need to, like, I can't fail. They can't see me weak. They can't see me fall down. They can't see me.
Yeah. And part of that is that social comparison. And a lot of that is driven from social media, and we're exposed to everything that people are saying, everything that people are doing. We become very distracted by that, where then most of our time is focused on that versus what we are doing, what we are saying, what our actions are. I think it's a lot easier to, be scrolling and getting ready to get ready with whatever it is that we want to do, rather than focusing and embracing on what we are doing.
Totally. We do those cards. We have those motivation cards that we often do in the morning. And one of them is something like, we're all imposters, just own that shit. And I thought it's brilliant because we talk about comparison. Here we are comparing ourselves to others, feeling inadequate, feeling like we fall short. And they're probably doing the same thing. They're looking at us and thinking exactly the same thing. I think for some, at least for me, the success and being successful, appearing successful, I was trying to meet a need. I didn't feel good about myself. I didn't have a healthy self-esteem by any stretch, and I've described it as deep self-loathing on former shows, and I still use that language because I think that describes it best. And so for me, success was a means to, well, at least when I'm doing that, I seem to be okay, or I get feedback that I'm doing okay. But the problem with that was because my foundation was so bad. no amount of success, no amount of accomplishment ever was enough, because deep down, I just thought I was fatally flawed, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to add, kind of going back to what you said, Rob, around, the right doors opened and sometimes we don't feel like we don't deserve the success or the cards that you were just mentioning. Everybody's an imposter. Looking at the podcast as an example, I just received a message from someone this week that said, wow, like, I just admire you all so much because, your podcast has become so successful in such a short time. You're sharing, such authentic, raw pieces of yourself. And it was a wonderful message, but still in my mind, sometimes it's, when we started this, it was, gosh, who am I to be on a podcast and to be sharing all of this kind of stuff? Like, I've done a bit of speaking, but not to the point, So I think for all of us that still shows up sometimes.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
And it's a great example because I think, we just did an episode and I think I said, we're not medical experts because we were talking about hormonal health for women and we were talking.
We know what you were talking about.
We know.
Steve, what were they talking about?
You can't say it.
Can't say the word.
You'll have to watch that show to find out what the word is. Now I don't have, my train of thought is gone. I don't even know what we were talking about. It's gone. We're going to it's flew.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. We were so busy talking about.
No,
the
you were
the podcast.
And we did our disclaimer. We were not.
Thank God there's a team. Talk about imposter syndrome.
When I lose my train of thought, someone might catch it for
your
me.
Your imposters are on your side.
But there's times where we talk about certain subjects, and we've talked about this, where I'm like, I just don't feel like I know enough to be able to speak about it, especially in this forum. And there's times where I feel like I got to do all this research and pull all this data and so that I feel comfortable about talking about it and feel like I know more, right? And I'm like, okay, well, I have some stuff and that's really not. That's this. Never. I know.
Yeah, what was that?
I don't know. That was
impressive. I knew that was coming in this episode.
For those of you listening, I just lowered my chair to its lowest.
But to tie into that, also there are times when we do an episode where we might, we're talking about scripts and overcoming scripts, and that week I might have been battling with a script that I didn't even come close to overcoming, right? Like that I'm actually sitting down at the mic and the script is right there fresh, and yet we're having these conversations, and we do talk about the fact that, and we recognize we're on a journey. We do not have this all figured out. Right. We sound, we're funny. We joke around. All of this. There are times when we are in very dark places still in our personal lives.
Absolutely.
But owning that is difficult to do. And that, as we get into later on, talking about how you break the imposter syndrome, part of it is that vulnerability to say, yeah, you know what? I'm faking it right now. Or I'm struggling right now is probably a better way to say that. That's the reality of it. For sure.
100%.
And that's the commitment to our audience, right? To the Living Richly Nation, is that we are journeying this one day at a time, one step at a time, that we don't have it all together, that we don't have all the answers, but we're just trying to share out of our own experience what we're learning along the way. And I heard someone once say, you don't have to have it all together to point the way. It's about calling people to a life larger than your own. While we're aiming for that life, we're not there yet, but we're all on a journey together, right? Let me ask this question, because there's imposter syndrome that tends to kind of stay with you. And then there's having a bad day, moments of self-doubt where your confidence takes a hit. How do you tell the difference?
Yeah, I think it's imposter. I think it's longer in duration. I think you have a bad day, you're not feeling like that can come and go. I think I can't even say it today. Imposter
feeling like a fraud.
Wow, feeling like a fraud. I think that's more of a mindset. I think that's more of a fear of being vulnerable, right? Like what you touched on, Rob. I think it's more deep rooted than that. I don't think it's my day, I'm not feeling confident going into work today, and I don't want to do this presentation. That might just be I don't feel great. I think it's just more of a sustained, not personality trait, but more of a way of thinking that is probably rooted somewhere in I'm not good enough, self-worth. I think it's really, or I'm scared to be vulnerable. It's tied to something bigger.
This came to me the other day, and I still need to process if I agree with what I'm about to say. I think I do.
It's okay. I'll let you know.
Yeah. You'll let me know if I'm wrong or not.
Exactly.
I have a right to be wrong.
You have a right to be wrong.
And I have a right to change my mind.
Here we go.
And I have a right to challenge you.
No, fuck you. But the notion is...
So, Rob, it's great to have you on the show today.
Yeah. Oh, when did you guys get here? The idea that self-doubt is often internal. It's how I'm seeing myself, whereas imposter syndrome is how I think others are seeing me. Right? It's external. It's if only they knew, if only they saw me. Whereas self-doubt is, I don't know if I can do this. It's tied to ability, perhaps. I'm not very good. All of that. I don't know whether or not if they're separated that way or not. Again, I haven't figured it out. It was the thought that kind of, there's something
I think
in
you
there
said
that
the way you
seems
said
to
it
make
earlier
sense.
Before the show was that you felt that self-doubt was more tied to a person's ability or performance, whereas imposter syndrome is more linked to one's character or one's perception of one's character.
See, I said it even more brilliantly then, right? Yeah.
Because I would say I agree with that 100%.
Of course you do, because I said it.
So, Kate, to follow up on what you said, no, because I think it is exactly what you just said, that, we may not feel great about a particular thing that we're doing at any given time, and there may be a bunch of factors impacting our confidence. I didn't get enough sleep. I kicked my dog this morning, or the dog kicked me. I don't know. I don't kick my dog.
Not kicking dog.
We shouldn't be dog. I know. I take it back.
If Loki's watching this episode,
sorry, Loki. No, I've never kicked my dog. No harm to animals. We're an animal harm-free zone here on the show. But there's so many things that could impact us in those moments. But I think both of you are 100% right that it's a prevailing perception of how one is in the world, that I feel like a fraud. As opposed to I'm feeling nervous or uncertain in this moment, right?
I think it festers over time as well. Like, I think if you're conscious of tracking your thoughts, feelings, and activities, if you start to feel like it shows up, and if you're tracking that, and that is showing up several times a week, I think that could be a sign that, okay, it's not just a bad day. Yeah. I'm, the habits that I'm demonstrating, lead directly to imposter syndrome. And okay, so now I know that this is the issue. How do I go about fixing it?
Right. Part of, we talk a lot about reframing on the show, right? Yeah. Looking at something differently and, changing the way that we perceive it or looking at it from a different angle. And I think one of the things that, strategies that can help us overcome a lot of hardships or challenges is seeing how that challenge or that issue is helping us. So when we think about feeling like a fraud or imposter syndrome, any positive benefits?
Yeah, I think there's one thing I think of is when you're in that imposter syndrome, I said it, space. I just want
Good job.
I'm going to applaud myself.
Kate.
There's no one else.
Cheers.
Is that you understand what it's like to feel uncomfortable. Like you feel like you're not showing up authentically. Right. So, and I think what that gives you is a lens of like empathy for other people. I think you start to see it in other people because you feel it yourself. So I think it gives you a bit of a lens of being empathetic to someone else who maybe you can see as doing something similar. Right. And so I think it just gives you a bit of that compassion, empathy for those around you.
Yeah, 100%. It's like walking in their shoes. You've been there. So you see it, you can recognize it. Yeah. And it might also just be easier to recognize in other people than yourself too. Yeah, right?
I think it connects you to people better when you recognize it and you're open and vulnerable about expressing it. You become more welcoming to people for them to be able to share their insecurities and struggles and how they're kind of battling with imposter syndrome. The more we're opened about it, sometimes people look at a leader, especially somebody who's successful doing great things, and they're not approachable.
Yeah.
And then when that person says, sometimes I feel like a fraud, they're like, oh my God, you too. And now you can really bridge that gap and connect to people more effectively when you own your own imposter syndrome.
100%. And yet, even as you said that, like people look at a leader and maybe make presumptions or assumptions about them having it all together. And just because people carry something well doesn't mean it isn't heavy. Right. And, like I
think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Powerful.
That's probably been my biggest I've found myself in leadership roles since the age of 17 years old. I'm always often the one people are looking to, relying on, depending on, whatever else. And there are times where I'm like, fuck, if you only knew, you wouldn't be leaning on me.
Yeah.
Well, and I was just at an event for International Women's Month, and Michelle Romano, who's one of the dragons from Dragon's Den, a very successful entrepreneur, made millions, and she talked about imposter syndrome. She's like, I still feel it. She's like, I can't sit here in front of you and not authentically say, you're always going to feel it. You will always feel it. She's like, it's not something that goes away. The doubt, all of it. She's like, I can sit in a room full of these like mega multimillionaires and she can still feel that way. So I think we have this view that at some point we're not going to feel it. I think we feel it on some level, but to hear her say it and she's so successful, to your point, was a big one for me.
And that's all tied to vulnerability.
100%.
When we give ourselves permission to be vulnerable and that we don't have it all figured out, it just opens up so many doors and breaks down so many walls and barriers that allows other people to be able to relate to what we're going through and allows us to share, like you mentioned, compassion as to what they're experiencing as well. I think that another positive side would be heightened self-awareness. So becoming very self-aware of the self-reflection, but the introspection on, did I say that right?
Introspection. You did.
What a good
Very
job.
good job. Introspection. That's 4 syllables.
Big words for a big podcast.
It's been a long day.
But I think it.
Oh, no. Are we all? It's hard to get back up.
It's hard.
Oh, wow.
There you go.
Not bad.
That's going to be a clip.
Just up and down, up and down.
Steve's shaking his head.
Yeah.
He's making
our
notes right now. Our
producer's about to fire us, I think.
But in all seriousness, I think it helps us keep our ego in check. We've all kind of crossed paths with people where, the ego comes out, in massive strides. And I think being able to recognize and having that self-awareness of imposter syndrome allows you to keep your ego in check, but also gives you that deeper understanding of what your strengths are, what your weaknesses, almost like your own SWOT analysis, right? Into those areas of growth.
Yeah.
So that can be a positive spin on it.
Yeah. I think the danger with imposter syndrome is it has a real negative bias.
Totally.
So I agree with you 100%. I think it can keep us grounded, can keep us centered, keep us humble. I know for me, it did more than that. It went beyond just keeping me in check. And I say it was that was my own doing. I own that 100%, but it has a real negative lens. It's usually not the lens of introspection of what do I want to be working on and what goal for growth. It's more like something's wrong with me and I have to fix it, right? But I think all those things.
Well, it leads to a lot of negative, even the words we use with ourselves. There's very little compassion in the language we use when we are dealing with imposter syndrome, right? It's I'm fake, I'm a fake, I'm a phony, I'm rotten, whatever it is, I'm a lie, all of this stuff. But to your point, it's when it's allowed to just run rampant within us, you can't have, I don't know how well you can be compassionate to yourself and also kind of just embracing the imposter syndrome. Again, to your point, you said earlier, it may never be gone, but I think the antidote to a lot of our imposter syndrome is self-compassion.
100%. And vulnerability.
And
right?
well, the vulnerability.
Was it Brené Brown says, when you own your story, you can write the ending. And I think it's really about learning to be kind to yourself. And when that voice shows up, to present a different script.
Yeah.
But that takes a lot of work. We've already talked a lot about, imposter syndrome in the workplace, imposter syndrome at home, in our parenting, and our, which one is most significant for you, and where does it show up the most? I know we touched on it at the beginning, but I'm curious if we could dive in a little bit more deeply there.
I'm ready to dive.
Dive deeply.
Dive
Go,
deeply.
Wendy.
Well, this relates to us, and I remember we had this conversation a couple of times as we started our relationship when we were dating. So imposter syndrome can show up absolutely in relationships. The comparison game, guilt over feeling not adequate enough. I know that was a big one for me, and doubting our worthiness and if we're good enough for our partner, and the fucking baggage that we bring along with it, right? And I remember talking so much, like when we had so many conversations, we still do, around, things that I struggle with, and I don't want to bring you down, and I don't want to be a downer in our relationship. The baggage that I had as a divorced mom. I mean, it's, as I was kind of navigating through that, and, my girls, being younger than your girls, and my girls aren't on their own yet. So it's more, time. And absolutely, of course, what I wanted to do as a mom, but feeling like I'm bringing this baggage into, this relationship. So I would say that can be a big thing for people.
Yeah, I relate to that. I related to almost ditto. We're back full circle. I'm not even gonna.
Back to when these, the very first few that you guys were on together. Ditto.
You said the word downer and baggage, and the word I use is burden.
Burden.
That I'm a burden to other
Yes.
people, and it shows up in my relationships on a regular basis.
Yeah, and burden's that's a powerful word. You talk about compassion and self-compassion. When that's your script, burden's a heavy word. Heavy word.
Yeah. And I feel like it's something that you have, like, you can say to your partner, like, no, you're not a burden and you don't have baggage. But at the end of the day, it really is our responsibility, and that self-ownership and self-reflect. Like, we can have support
for sure
from the people in our lives and the people that love us. But at the end of the day, it's a choice that we make to be able to have that self-reflection and that self-responsibility on changing that language that we use.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I figured it all out.
I was going to say.
That's why you're on the show, Wendy. It's why you're here.
You're the expert.
You're here to guide us. You're our guiding light, Wendy.
I don't have any imposter syndrome. When Wendy's on the show, she's taking care of the whole thing.
She's taking care of business. Yeah. What about you, sir?
So I don't know how much. I think where it shows up more on the personal side since we've launched Living Richly. And part of it is because there have been a lot of adjustments and changes, and people who knew me kind of pre-doing this work, sometimes the thoughts go, so it's not really imposter. I don't know. That's not really that they think I'm an imposter, or that I'm, even though I know that I'm doing the work. I think it could there. So that's more the self-doubt, I think, or the insecurity around that. I think in relationships, I feel like I am able to, I think I come across pretty authentically, and pretty much what you see is what you get, warts and all. For me, it probably the area it shows up the most still would be professionally, in the notion of trying to come in and go, can I really bring something to the table here? Like, they're looking at me like I'm the expert, and I'm like, and it's kind of being able to bring that truth to them, of whatever they're needing, and not feeling like if they only knew, they wouldn't be working with me, or whatever the case might be. I think that's where it comes out to play more than anything.
I still remember a story. This was early on when you had joined the team, and you were really concerned about this one particular client that you were going into, I think, every session wondering, I think that
he's going to fire me this
time. This is going to be the last one. And you were really concerned about it. And I said to you, why don't you just ask him, like, how how's it going?
You want me to find out the truth?
Right. And I remember you went in the next session and you found your courage and you asked him.
Yeah.
And he had nothing but amazing things to say about
exactly.
the value he was getting out of the conversations with you. So it's so fascinating to me how others who know us well can look at where we're struggling with imposter syndrome or self-doubt or lack of confidence and often go like, what do you mean? Like I see you shining there and I see you so strong there. And yet we look at ourselves and we can be that cheerleader for someone else. But I often struggle when it comes to being my own. I come a long way, but it still shows up.
But I think that's like coming a long way. That I think it's so important to talk about because I think for me, it shows up everywhere. I'll be honest. Like, as a mom, it's probably the hardest one for me. And I touched on that earlier. But what I have noticed is over time, it's less and less. And I think part of that is doing the work. I think part of that is getting, more comfortable in my own skin, feeling like I'm living a more vulnerable life. I'm being more authentic. And with that, it's sort of the more authentic you get, the imposter syndrome goes down, right? Because they really do counteract each other.
I love that you said that, and because that really, even for me, it helps in how I'm trying to formulate this in my brain, in the sense that I wouldn't necessarily say I'm part of the 30% who don't struggle with imposter syndrome, but it's low for me. And I think of even with my kids, when I look at my kids, I know I'm a good dad. I know that I show up genuinely with them. Do I believe that I've always been a good dad? No. Now, they would probably say, no, you've always been a good. But I know that there were many seasons where I was more focused on the work. I was more focused on other stuff. And I've dealt with guilt around that. But I can say I can easily, if I was sitting with one of my girls today, in fact, I've had these conversations that maybe I wasn't there the way I would have liked to have been, but I'm here now. And so I don't come in struggling with, I'm not who I pretend to be this and I'm not. I'm so I think I'm, in most cases, I'm comfortable to say, yeah, no, I really did. I fucked up for a lot of years and I was not good. And I did fail in being a parent for, in many ways, but I know who I am today. And I feel so there's a confidence there that I am showing up. Some days I'm not good for my kids today. Most of the time though I am, but I own it when I'm not.
When I hear both of you speak around, just the first thing that popped into my head is you're both celebrating and congratulating yourself versus, so when I think of like 4 C's, I'm just pulling this out of my ass. We spend a lot of time being critical and condescending. And then as we kind of sail through that journey, where you like where this is going?
I don't know. It's
critical and condescending. And then that's translating into celebrating and congratulating yourself over the years. So it was the first thing that popped into my head, just hearing both of you speak.
Like being able to that's one of the hardest things, is to celebrate the wins is actually one of the hardest.
Yes.
Where it's way easier to be critical,
Totally.
right? But to actually say, no, you know what? I'm a good parent today. Like, we don't often do that. What we often say is, oh, I shit the bed today, or I didn't show up as I wanted to show up, or I got too angry, or whatever. Like, we all have that, but we don't actually, like, how many of us at the end of the day go, wow, I did a great job today, parent.
Right.
We just don't.
No.
And so it's leaning more into that. I really like that.
Yeah. It's
celebrating.
Let's talk about failure for a second, because it's, I think when things are going well or relatively well, most of us probably aren't struggling too much with imposter syndrome unless, you have an underlying real damaged sort of sense of self, which I can relate to. Had to do a lot of work to overcome that. But when things are going well, we tend to feel better about ourselves and the world. That's just I think the way humans function. And when we experience failure or setback, I think it has a way of triggering self-doubt, imposter syndrome, quite significantly. Let's talk about how you guys reframe failure so that imposter syndrome doesn't take as much a toll on you in those moments.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I don't know if I reframe it. I think sounds awful, but I'll look around a room and think someone else in this room maybe feels like an imposter in this moment as much as I do. And that makes me feel better.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's to know that, that what I'm feeling isn't mine and mine only, and that other people feel this way. And somehow for me that it breaks something for me, and it allows me to remind myself that, and when I'm in that, I'm not feeling so impostery. I made up a word.
We're making up words.
Well, I'm having a hard time with the whole sentence.
We're having a hard time with some of the words we're using. We're just going to make them up. We're going to make them up.
Yeah. So I think for me, it's retraining my language. And it's something I've really tried to work hard on, and I'm still trying to work hard at it. But being able to put my blinders on and focus more about what I'm doing and what I'm saying to myself and what I'm telling myself versus what I think other people are thinking. So, when I go back to my journey of leaving the HR space and moving into the fitness space and those conversations, now granted, I did have a few people, say these types of words to me. But if I'm truly honest with myself, most of that was conversations that I created in my own head. And because I think we're master storytellers. So when I think about, who certified me to give health and wellness advice, what credentials do you have? Who do you think you are? Retraining that language. But that takes practice. And anytime I feel frustrated, those frustrations are those misplaced expectations on what I think people are doing, saying, feeling, when most of my energy really should be focused on what I'm doing and what I'm saying and what I'm thinking versus creating imaginary scripts on with.
Yeah, I think there's so much to this notion. Again, we talked about earlier, you made the comment about reframing imposter syndrome even, and seeing that is there a positive part. And I think the same is true of failure. Failure is not a 4-letter word. Right? It's not a bad word. It's and yet most successful people I know, when you at least have a one-on-one conversation, they don't see failure as bad.
Right.
And so it seems to be that successful people have a tendency to be able to own failure easier. I don't know if that's accurate. I know for me, when I fail, my natural, I'm phony. When I fail, I look at it and go, okay, so now what am I learning from this? What's the lesson? What didn't work? What did work? How do I grow? It's an opportunity to learn every failure. And so I don't wish for failure, but failure is inevitable. Maybe it goes back to Ben Bergeron's mindsets. Right? The realist knows there's going to be failure. Right.
Yeah. It's not all a bed of roses.
It's not all optimism, right? It's not pessimism. It's not everything's going to be bad. So as a realist just looks and goes, oh, we failed there. Okay. That's interesting. What do we do with that?
Yeah. Right.
And then just moves on to the next opportunity.
Yeah. It's been said, the only true failure is the failure to learn. Right. If you're learning, then failure is your teacher, your mentor, as opposed to your accuser and your critic. We've been peppering this whole conversation with strategies and things that we say, do, and try, and that have helped us. Let's dive in there. I think for the sake of our listeners, and I'm curious for my own sake, I want to hear more of what you have to say in terms of strategies that help you in those moments where you're struggling with feeling like a fraud.
Well, let me right out of the gate, stop shooting all over yourself, right? I think the first strategy, language matters. And when you are feeling that, whatever that imposter syndrome, however it's showing up, I think one of the first strategies is to ask, how else can I say this? How else can I view this? So what are other words? What's the language I can use to say this differently than the way I'm saying it now? Can oftentimes, because our words, again, lead the way to the feelings that we have, the emotions we have. Change the language, you change the scripts, you change the emotion that you feel out of it.
Right, 100%. Really good. You can't say ditto. Neither one of you have said anything yet.
It's very powerful. We didn't have anything else to add.
You just communicated it like telepathically.
But I think that's so key. I think it's how you speak to yourself. Yeah. I think it's the the language you use as an imposter is not kind. It's not nice. It tends to be pretty harsh and critical. So to be able to start shifting how you speak to yourself, or even looking at that scenario, that room where you're feeling it, and switch the narrative, I do think it's so compelling.
Yeah.
It's so bang on.
I think there's a balance between silencing your inner critic and learning to invite it to the table. Ask it to stay for dinner and a drink, and listen to what it's saying.
Romance it first.
Sit down, bitch. Have a drink.
Steve better put the right music on.
I want some good music for that.
Right.
But being able to recognize, and so, I've never been a fan of the saying out of sight, out of mind. And I'm not saying completely ignore it. I think you do need to still recognize that it's there. Finding that balance between listening to what that, we've talked about this before, the bitch side of your voice is, versus the rational side of your voice. Listening to what it has to say, but also not letting it dictate your action. And I think recognizing that there is going to be discomfort, the only way to grow is to experience discomfort.
Yeah.
Anybody that says they've grown without any, roadblocks, speed bumps, discomfort, it just doesn't happen. There has to be some discomfort, but you have to be able to trust that discomfort in order to be able to move past that and overcome what your inner critic is telling you to do, say, respond.
Yeah, I think it all really does come down to what you say to yourself in those moments. I know for me, and this is a more recent one, I'm coming to terms with the reality that I probably suffer from some sort of seasonal affective disorder. I'm in the throes of it right now, actually have been for probably the last month or so. And where I feel most like an imposter is when I'm weak, and I'm not at my best, and it's hard. And as I'm wrestling with that, I tend to be pretty good with my language, except in these moments, where I feel like I'm a bit compromised. But I'm learning and training to ask myself better questions than, what the fuck's wrong with you, Deschamps? Why can't you just snap out of this? Come on, just pick yourself up and get back to, their normal self. And learning to ask a kinder question of, what do you need right now? What do I need? And that's helping. That's helping.
It's so good. And you didn't do it there. I was hoping you would. You didn't add the word Eric. Eric, what do you need right now? And I remember when you first shared that with me and you used that language, and I reflected back. It was David Goggins in his second book. He talks about how, and the way he speaks to himself, and he does this intentionally so that he recognizes who's speaking, is when he's critical, when he's challenging, when he's saying, what the fuck's wrong with you? He calls himself Goggins. And when he's speaking to himself compassionately and he's with grace, it's David or Dave, whatever. But he does that intentionally. He's training himself to do that as a way of starting to recognize the two voices. And I love that you did that when you what the fuck's wrong with you, Deschamps, versus Eric, what do you need right now? Just doing something as simple as that in those moments, that just takes practice. Suddenly you recognize, I know who speak. I know it's my bitch voice versus my rational voice, whatever the language is. Now I can address it accordingly. Yeah. Right. And begin to work through what those things are. So it's a powerful thing. I thank you for sharing and being that open and vulnerable. Again, the journey that we're on, that you can be in a season like that right now and yet come on a show and say, hey, there's hope. There's a journey. We're living our best lives, even though right now I don't feel it.
Yeah. Well, I think setbacks, at least, you have seasons where you're doing better. You've done the work, you're growing, you're maturing, but not all growth is forward. And sometimes growth feels like a few steps back.
Speed bumps,
right? Mm-hmm. And in those moments, I constantly reminding myself what's helpful is to remind myself, because I tend, my tendency, again, imposter syndrome, the tendency is, was it all a show? Was any of it real? Have I actually, because here I find myself struggling with my thoughts again, struggling with the negativity, right? Only to recognize there's something bigger playing out here. This isn't just a mind thing. There's something bigger affecting all of it. But I get very critical on myself, and I have to remind myself in those moments. And I shared this on an episode we did last year at this time. I'm only now beginning to recognize the pattern, but it was about this time last year. I went through a hard time, didn't recognize it for what it was. And the notion of our brains are plastic, not elastic. And we talk about neuroplasticity. We talk about the brain's ability to continue to grow in moments. So our brains are plastic, but in moments where I fall down or I'm not doing great, I tend to feel like I've snapped back to a previous version of myself. It's like an elastic. I've been and that's actually not what's happening. I'm grateful that as I walk through this, I have better tools than I've ever had. I have amazing woman at my side. I've got great friends. I've got better resources than I've ever known. And I'm confident, I'm going to walk through it.
And you've got better language, right? And I've seen it this time around, where in the past you didn't have the language to use to talk about what you were going through. Whereas today, when we've had conversations and you've been processing a little bit of the emotion of what you're going through, you've got the right language to use in order to begin to really develop, get to where you need to get to.
The language may be better in conversation with you than sometimes what's running through my head.
Right. Boy, that sounded like imposter syndrome right there.
Right? Happy to be a living example. Let's shift the focus off me completely now and back onto you.
I like it on you.
Yeah, I don't. Other strategies that you guys lean to or turn to when going through and facing imposter syndrome.
One thing, and we talked about this on successes, try writing your successes down. So a success journal is not something we do. I was just joking about, I was a great parent today, but that we don't do it. I know, I always do that jig. I don't know what the jig's about today.
I've never seen it before.
Feels like it's from like
today you've got it. I know it's because we're coming close. We're recording this really close to St. Patrick's Day.
Is that? I'm getting my jig on. I'm getting my jig on.
Yeah.
But celebrate your success.
Getting jiggy with it.
I had to do something else. But write them down and give yourself permission to honor that. And that just I think it helps, big believer in pen to paper. I've said this before on the show, but writing things down makes them more real. I think it also allows you to just appreciate a little bit more who you are, right? And so it gives you a bit of that self-worth back, which can tie into giving you almost permission to show up more authentic.
Well, writing it down is, again, it's easy to do, but easier not to do. It's a great tool to have because we can circulate that kind of stuff in our head, but we forget about it so easily.
Yeah.
And as humans, we're very visual. Having that visual in front of you where you've taken the time to, write down those items, write down your wins, celebrating yourself, like what I just mentioned, so that when you have those days where you feel like, that voices saying that you're no good or you're going through all, it's a big imposter day, you can pull that book out and remind yourself. And visual is memorable when it's written down there. That just allows you to tie back to shifting your focus and your feelings.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think expose it to the light. Right? Our misery is so much louder in darkness and
in solitude.
And in solitude. And so when we, having, you mentioned about, a wonderful woman, trusted friends, having those people that you could say, hey, this is what I'm feeling right now. And being vulnerable enough to say, I feel like an imposter here, so that those other people can build up and encourage and be a part of that and shed light on that darkness.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. I think isolation, there are moments and seasons where we need solitude, and solitude is actually a powerful reflective exercise where we can get present with ourselves. But I think when you're in a bad headspace and really struggling with self-doubt and imposter syndrome, that's probably not the time to be alone too much, because loneliness, isolation tends to fuel those thoughts even more when you're in the presence of people that care for you and you care for, they can be that voice of reason. If you can't be that voice of reason for yourself, they can bring some truth and some encouragement to the table. So I think surrounding yourself with the right people and resisting the temptation to withdraw from life, because that's, I know, something I still am working on, but I'm grateful that that's what I've been doing. And at least in this season, I was just referring to earlier, and it's making a big difference. So I love all of it, writing it down, bringing it to the light, talking about it. I think takes the edge off of it.
Yeah, and I would honor the fact that the isolation and the draw to the isolation is very real when you're in that. So to be able to pull back and connect when you really don't want to connect is one of the hardest things to do. And I love the language you use. You like it, learning, practice, right? And that's a practice skill, because innately you just want to retreat into yourself and cocoon from the world. So I think it's amazing that you've been doing that and leaning into that more.
Yeah.
Huge.
Thank you. Let's talk about sort of the most important thing as we prepare to wrap up here. It's been a great conversation, bit of an emotional one for me, but what's the most important thing each of you want our listeners to remember from this show as we're talking about imposter syndrome, lack of confidence, the rest of it? If you had one word of advice, one truth bomb you'd want to leave with them, what would it be?
I would change the language from imposter syndrome to growth syndrome. Shifting that focus and embracing the discomfort around that, but shifting it to these are the negative thoughts that I'm having around why I'm not A, B, and C. Here's how I'm going to change that language, and really literally changing that language to this is part of my growth. And recognizing that everybody deals with it, but not everybody talks about it.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue that 70% is higher.
Right. Well, and like you said, when
70% are the ones who report having it.
You being in that room and recognizing, absolutely, there's people here that are struggling with it. They're just not speaking about it.
Well, that's it. And I think one thing I would encourage people to do is, when you're in that high imposter syndrome space, like, what if you allowed yourself just to show up a little bit more authentically? You don't have to lean full in, but what if a bit more of you and your vulnerability showed up, and then read the room and get a feel for how you feel and how the people around you shift or don't shift. But start leaning in bit by bit as you start to show up more authentically, and just see how that space feels for you.
I love that.
Yeah. I would say radical self-acceptance. It's radical. Right. And Eric, when you introduce that language to me, and it's radical self-acceptance is a verb. It's an action, right? It's movement. It's continuous. And it's in these moments when self-acceptance doesn't work. It's why we need radical self-acceptance. And I would say for anybody that is in that moment of struggling with imposter syndrome, that's the moment to embrace the radicalness of self-acceptance.
Yeah. And I would add to that, reach out. Don't isolate, don't withdraw. That's the time you need to connect. You may want to go hide under a rock, but that's not going to help. I actually showed up to this. I was not looking forward to shooting this episode today by any stretch. And thank you for allowing me just to show up as I am. But yeah, show up as you are, be kind to yourself, and connect. Guys, thank you. This has been an amazing conversation.
Great show.
Yeah.
And I hope it's been meaningful for you that are watching and listening. Thank you for tuning in. We're so grateful that you're part of the Living Richly Nation, and your support of the show. We are so blessed to see its success and to get feedback on a regular basis from you about how it's impacting your lives. And we just hope to continue that journey with you. And we encourage you to send us your, I almost said mail in.
Wow.
Send us a fax with your questions and suggested topics you'd like us to cover. We'd happy to tackle those and dive into those. As always, we encourage you to like, share, and subscribe. Get the word out. Help us spread this message of living your best life and reaching your full potential. Make sure to check out our website, livingrichly.me, where you can find out more about our 15-day vision challenge, which is a free experience that could be revolutionize your life, and also find out about our private Facebook group. There are links to both those things right there at our website, and we have a great community there of hundreds of people now that on a weekly, daily basis are sharing their stories and exchanging tips and strategies about doing just what we're talking about here. Folks, thanks again for tuning in, and until next week, keep living your best life.